Jai Guru, everyone.
Jai Guru.
Jai Guru. And welcome to another episode. We are beginning chapter 3 this time. Very, very exciting. The Saint with Two Bodies. Very intriguing indeed. I've got with me Priyank and Chris. Let's say hello.
Hello.
Hi, everyone.
Hello. So we will jump straight in to this one. So the title, The Saint with Two Bodies. I wondered how people felt when they first read this title. It's quite an evoking one, isn't it, for the mind? You know, it's quite intriguing. And Priyank reminded us that there are many, as he puts it, crazy titles in the book. So Priyank, would you like to talk us through that?
Yeah, some may think the title would be intriguing. To my mind, it's hard to remember what I thought about it all those years ago, but I think I would have thought of it as pretty insane, wacky, Delali, even with my Indian background, with all sorts of insane stories of the Hindu gods and goddesses. This, for me, was pretty wild, the spectrum of wildness, probably like 9 out of 10. But then I was thinking, what about the other titles? Levitating Saint is probably the not equally, but not as bad. Probably, what would you say, 5 out of 10 for wildness, 6 maybe. Sleepless Saint, someone who doesn't sleep, maybe 4 out of 10. Probably some Westerners, insomniacs that are like that, but this is obviously not an insomniac. It's someone that's quite advanced spiritually. And then there was Gashi Reborn and Discovered. For me, that wasn't that wild because reincarnation is prevalent in my thought when I read it. So that you probably put that as a 5 out of 10 or something. Rama raised from the dead. That's another pretty wild one. Resurrection thoughts come to mind. I'd probably put that as like a 7 or an 8 out of 10, maybe even 9. Materializing a palace in the Himalayas. What would you score that, Lauren?
I've got to be really honest. None of these chapter titles surprised me at all, and I'm actually shocked that you were so, like, wow about them. It just felt normal.
What? So then we have to rate you on a scale of wildness then.
I don't know, I just feel like it makes sense. You're reading about a yogi, you're gonna have these types of things.
Really?
And I think for me, like, I love the whole realm of possibilities, right? So this is like, okay, yeah, that does make sense, and I'm glad that someone's talking about it.
Wow, Lauren, you're the first person I've met that like read the autobiography and thought everything. You didn't think that it would, well, just by the title, you thought it would be fine to proceed.
Yeah, I'm more like, wow, I'm so intrigued. What's this like? What's going to happen now?
Chris?
It's a childlike sense of play, I guess. What do you think, Chris?
I guess what we're really talking about is the aspect of being skeptical about what it is that what information we're receiving, right? And I would like to think that I'm a very skeptical person, to the point of annoyance to some of the people like close to me, because I do try to seemingly I'm confrontational because I'm so skeptical about certain things. But actually, I'm more in the camp of what you were saying, Lauren. Maybe struggle to recollect exactly what I thought about the title, but I accepted everything. I was already with Guruji, aligned with him, and this was him sharing his experience, which I accept wholeheartedly. I was already there, when I first read the book. So it's funny, actually. The only thing that strikes me is that, like, how much I was already on board. And you could be skeptical about that in itself. And I suppose you could go on and on about being skeptical about why we do anything. But I suppose it does strike me now, looking back at how much I was in tune with exactly what Guruji was what information he was giving me. Because normally I would be super skeptical about everything and any information I get.
Very interesting, because the fact that both of you were pretty accepting and not too freaked out by these titles puts credence to there's a long thought hypothesis out there amongst Hindus, that Westerners that take on Hinduism or parts of Hinduism, such as what we have in the West to Guruji's teachings, are more they're more malleable. Their brains are, the way they're thinking is they're more even more so than Indians, more able to, more receptive to it. So there's this whole theory out there amongst Indians, and you two are proving that to be so. Chris?
Can I just add to this, and I hope I don't ruffle feathers when I say this, but how much of life do we not find striking enough? I.e., when I was growing up, heavy meat intake, was a common thing. Living your life in certain ways, alcohol intake is common. If you don't drink alcohol, you get the head tilt and the inflection of the tones, like what? Like why? Like you don't drink, like you don't eat meat, that's unusual in certain traditions. So there's a lot that we could be skeptical about in life that we're not skeptical. So this felt normal to me. This felt reasonable. And actually, this sounded like truth to me. And there's other little things in my life, like what I've just mentioned, that probably rubbed me up the wrong way, but I didn't quite know why, because what we're going to talk about today, which maybe segues a little bit, but is the environment to which we keep is actually super important.
Indeed. Indeed. So the last one that I just said, which was materializing a palace in the Himalayas, for me that was a 10 out of 10 in terms of wildness, especially after having even read the content. The content is as wild as the chapter. if not even more wild. So you might raise it, like call it a 10 on reading the title of the chapter. When you read the chapter, you've got to go 11, 12 out of 10. And yeah, Chris?
I think Mike and I may have said that was one of the most memorable chapters for both of us. Several episodes ago at the beginning, we were saying, which stood out, and it was the Career Science chapter. For me, really kind of hit it home that there was a way out of, let's say, your own kind of personal hell that you might find yourself in through mathematical precision, as it were. But this chapter stood out to myself, and I think Mike noted it as well as a favorite chapter of his, if I'm not mistaken. So there you go. With the madness, seeming madness, comes intriguing fascination. So hence why Guruji included it in the book, I imagine.
And then the other two chapters I've put on this list is the resurrection of Sri Yukteswar. So the content of that is probably an 11 out of 10 again. And then the woman who never eats chapter. All of those were wild chapters for me. But coming back to this one, the saint with two bodies. Just wanted to let's briefly talk about our expectations of this chapter, and then we can just talk about how we found this chapter as a whole before we delve into it, perhaps what bits we're looking forward to. I don't know. My expectations from this chapter, as I said, I thought it was going to be a bit wild, but then when I thought about it, I thought there was obviously going to be some very mystical elements to it, because this is the first chapter of the three where there's he makes you dive all in on mysticism. Chris?
You would be forgiven if you thought there was something occult about this chapter, but there's not really, is there? It's quite open, but for me, what I'm looking forward to dissecting and becoming a bit more intimately familiar with is Guruji's reactions. He's a child here, and he does give you this story through the eyes of a child, essentially. So it's him coming upon the realities of the life of, you know, great saints and enlightened and beings. So he's given you this insight through his eyes when he was a child. So that for me is really special, I think, which we're going to delve into in this episode as well. But for me, it's a lovely, intimate relationship that you can build with Guruji, and this is one of the chapters that helps me do that.
So it's a very strange, having read the chapter, it's a very strange chapter. Again, I read it again, obviously, for this podcast, because it's to glean, to really get something out of it, you've really got to reflect. It's not something that is obvious, like, you know, he talks about purpose of Kriya in some episodes, and, you know, Lahiri Mahashai blessing him, so it's like obvious, you know, what the meaning is and what you should get out of it. For this one, the story in the arc, you know, how Lahiri Mahashai comes into it, and, you know, Swami Pranabananda telling us about his experiences with Lahiri Mahashai, and the miracles, obviously, with the two bodies. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to digging into this one, because it wasn't, from reading it, it's not straight away apparent what lessons should be for us.
And going on from that, shall we dive in? Are you
Yes.
ready?
Yes.
So we have our title, which is, as Priyank says, pretty wild. But then it starts quite normally with Guruji, as a young boy, Mukunda, asking his father if he can take a trip, a sightseeing trip to Banaras without coercion. He says, if I promise to return home without coercion, can I take a sightseeing trip? And I thought that was an interesting way to ask his father to go, because he's really trying to appeal to that nature of, oh, we know, I'll come, you know, if I come straight home, can I go? And I feel like we all did that as children, didn't we? We tried to appeal to our parents to get that thing that we wanted. I know I certainly did that. I used to write letters to my parents whenever I wanted something, and I tried to use all the different techniques. So yeah, it's often found in young people, isn't it, Priyank?
Indeed. But yeah, in the coercion element of this I think he's referring to his ways of trying to flee and go to the Himalayas after his vision of the Himalayan yogis, and then, you know, he kind of ran away with Dwaraka Prasad, tried to, and this is in the previous chapter, and obviously Ananta caught him. So this is like you know, him trying to plea because he was coercion was a factor in the previous chapter to come back.
It is interesting here. He says quite quickly on that it was his love for travel was seldom hindered by his father. So whatever coercion he had to do, it was quite readily accepted by his father. So even with this threat of running away to the Himalayas, he's obviously had experience of being successful in doing these trips and doing these you know, travels with maybe presumably his friends in tow. But his father was a strict disciplinarian in some ways, but obviously given this freedom to roam, and it is nice to see, isn't it? Like he had faith in him and trusted him, and he's obviously, as we know, an avatar. So he would have been walking with God in many cases, so quite safe and secure. Maybe his father would have taken that into consideration to some extent as well.
Do you think he wanted to go to Benaras because that was the family home of Lahiri Mahashai, and he wanted to go see or take a pilgrimage there, because he calls it a sightseeing trip? But Guruji's father obviously knows what's in the magic that's in Banaras, and or Varanasi now it's called, and yeah, and but they don't mention it here, so perhaps he went but didn't tell us.
Yeah, I was intrigued about that too, because that detail isn't in there. And I always thought, oh, what was he going to actually see if this hadn't have happened? What would his trip have actually looked like? But it's so interesting to me how he lived as a young boy, how, you know, he goes on to say that he often traveled to cities and pilgrimage spots, and he was permitted by his father to do this. And at this time, he was 12 and younger. So it's almost unfathomable to me as an English Westerner growing up in the time that I did. That just, that would not have happened for me at all. I remember, you know, going to the shop with my sister on our own at the age of 8 and, you know, 11 was a massive thing. Like, wow. So for this to have happened and for him to have traveled so freely must have been really wonderful. What do you think, Priyank?
Yeah, it's a feature actually of the culture in India where youth are afforded a lot more freedom. I'll give you an example. Like the boys are allowed to drive their scooters on the road with or without a license, and the police don't seem to mind. They know that it's not going to be legal, but it's just like this tolerated thing, accepted thing. And like taking that one step further, so everyone usually just leaves their house doors open. The door, like, and in most parts of India, it's not like a door that's, you know, a wooden door that's shut. There's usually like a metal frame, like you know, bars, so you can, you know, air can flow freely through. So there's open that and close it, just and leave it ajar. So everything is usually open, and people just, neighbors would wander in and out, and it's a very different level of trust in India, not just with, and even with your own children. Like you won't know whether, if you're living in a little street with, say, 20 houses in the street, they're all very, very close to each other, especially in rural India. So you if you have a child, he'd just roll into any of those houses, and you wouldn't at any one given time, if he's not in your house, you wouldn't know which of those houses he's in. But just one brief holler out the door, and someone will say, "Yes, he's here," or "Yes, I've fed him. Yes, he's sleeping in my room upstairs." It's really quite a romantic way of life, actually, compared to how it is in the West.
You know, Yogananda reportedly saw Los Angeles as the Banaras of the United States, due to there was something in the character that set it apart as a destination for explorers of the soul. That's what was said about Benaras. So maybe he was going there as a way of exploring the soul, or the soul's exploring things. But he met Sri Yukteswar on the streets of Benaras as well, right? So was that Benaras?
I can't have to recall. I can't remember. I think it may have been.
So he obviously, you know, had this timeless link to Benaras as a result of that, if that is true, which I hope it is. I think it is. So many reasons for him to be drawn to Benaras.
And it also says in the chapter that, you know, whenever he or his other family members, which he describes as nomads of the family, which I liked, whenever they'd travel, they'd go first class because of his father's position in the railway, which must have been very lovely as a young boy, knowing that you were actually very cared for in your journey going. But what I love is, after he's made this appeal to his father and explained about this, his father says, "Yep, I'll give it some consideration." And then the next day, not only does he summon Mukunda and say, "Yes, you can go," but he actually hands him round trip tickets and money and 2 letters. So not only has he gone to the effort of considering this for his child, he's actually gone further and made the effort to make sure that he's really looked after and that this is actually going to happen, which I think is really lovely. you know, as a parent, to do that, to say, yes, you can go, and here's everything you need. That's really beautiful.
I thought it was interesting that yeah, true, you know, how he caters for his little whim of a wish to go to Banaras, which is not it's not just a aspiration that you can easily, as a father or a spiritual father, easily just shrug off your shoulder, because it's quite a spiritual aspiration, isn't it? So it's something that he actually in his heart wants to encourage. But obviously he's a mere boy. So I love the fact that his father slept on it, and I think there's a little message in there for us. Often we make decisions very quickly, and the art of reflection, and in the art of reflection overnight, for example, in his father's case, he would have allowed, you know, the thought to dwell in his subconscious, and he would, you know, in his meditation, it would have been there in the background of the meditation. Perhaps even he may have had a conversation with God after his meditation practices, you know, asking him, shall I send my son? And God may have, you know, provided the response. But there's certainly something we should do with most walks of our life that don't require a decision and an action there and then, because that will allow us the maximum possibility of going on the path that goes towards our self-realization, as opposed to just going on an egoistic whim that may be a imperfect response to a situation.
He was a single parent by this point, right? So the thought occurred to me, if Yogananda's mother would have been there, would he have been given, you know, this freedom to roam? And like the stereotype, of course, you know, you would lean towards the no. You know, mother tends to be a little bit more protective over, and the father's stereotypically or generally a little bit more loose and ready to take on, you know, risk and danger and things like this. But obviously, like Priyank, I think what you said there hit the nail on the head. When you said maybe consulting with God, you know, meditating, I was more thinking about the wife, you know, trying so am I doing the right thing? You know, but yeah, I'm sure he was at peace with his decision. So,
And not only does he let him go, but he gives him a very important task, which for a young boy of 12, I think is quite admirable, that his father trusted him with this matter, or perhaps he also had some other insights about it. Who knows? That's for speculation. But he says that he has a business matter to propose to his friend, Kedar Nath Babu, but he's lost his address. So he believes that he'll be able to get this letter through, he says, a common friend, Swami Pranabananda, who's a brother disciple, which I think is interesting. Obviously under Lahiri Mahashai. So again, we're bringing Lahiri Mahashai subtly into this this section. And yeah, we'll leave that little section there for a second. Yes, Priyank.
Yeah, I just wanted to talk briefly about what Swami Pranabananda means. So Guruji spelled it Pranabananda, but in Sanskrit the word is pranava. In Bengali, V's become B's, so va becomes ba for some reason. But so yeah, prana is from the prana, you know, the life force, the prana. So pranava is a practice of yoga which focuses on the Om techniques. So that is potentially kind of practice perhaps that he was working on. Om meditation technique is something that we obviously have in Self-Realization Fellowship. Perhaps he was a master of that, hence Lady Mahashaya may have named him Swami Pranabananda.
It would have been interesting to have had that in a footnote, because then you do get an insight as to like who this soul is in this body, you know. but his father does go on to say that he has an exalted spiritual stature, which just paints a really, really powerful image of who this soul is. You know, it's not going to be a usual trip to see a friend, you know. Yeah, Chris.
It also spoke to me a little bit about Yogananda's father himself, to recognize the exaltation in one generally, to me, would mean that you can see it reflected in yourself to a degree. And we know that he was very much dedicated to his practice, went in, retreated nightly to practice his Kriya. So to me, it speaks of, as we're going to again talk about in a bit, with good company. You know, there's somebody himself who's probably quite enlightened, and you know, we can talk about the degree of that, you know, what evidence we have for the degree of it, but it really spoke to me very highly of Bhagavati himself.
How do you mean, Chris? Scratching beneath the surface of what you just said. So if I was fortunate enough to be in the presence of Paramahansa Yogananda, I'd hope I'd see his exalted spiritual nature. Heaven, you know, maybe not. You don't know. If you didn't know who he was, I don't know. So say I did see his exalted spiritual nature. Are you suggesting that then somehow that's also reflected in me?
Yes.
How so?
Quite literally, I think, because you know, the horse can be led to water, but it might not drink, or ignorance might cloud all judgment. And how many stories could you think about where, even in the autobiography of a yogi or Yogananda, has told us that you could be amongst throngs of crowds and it's chaos, and maybe that's quite an apt description of India in some ways from what people have told me. I haven't been there myself, but there's chaos, there's people, but amongst the chaos there's still divine saints and divine saintly people. And if you're attuned, you'll be able to recognize and see this. And there was actually a comment by one of the listeners that we had somewhere to this effect, where I had made a comment about Northern Ireland not being able to see many saints kind of walking around in garbs and, you know, things like this. And there was a nice comment by one of the listeners to say, yeah, but don't be fooled, because there are many people walking around having done Kriya or initiations in some way, maybe in more secretive terms. So
yeah, that was the email. I think she said she knows of at least some ministers that are taking lessons in private from the clergy, SRF, Self-Realization Fellowship lessons. So in the probably Protestant churches in Northern Ireland, and they're taking lessons.
There you go. Amazing. Like, you could talk about that for an hour. But essentially, my point is, maybe the radar of your own spiritual radar is something that we can all work on, like the intuitive sense of being able to recognize divinity in others. Yogananda talks about maybe going in to see saintly individuals, and he himself would try to get into a real meditative state, and then enter a room, I think, with the story of, I forget the name, but the lady with
Teresa Neumann. Yeah.
Teresa Neumann.
Yes.
That was one example. So that's what I'm more thinking of, that you can get yourself into these states and recognize divinities in others.
Well, there is also that school of thought that we experience the world as we are, and all that we experience and see are merely reflections of us in our current state. So I suppose if we can see the divinity in others, and we can see that exalted nature, then that is existent in our very being. And if we think about what we are, you know, souls born of the divine, then yes, of course. I mean, it may be clouded in so many layers that we aren't yet able to live fully in that way. But yeah, I feel like there's definite power in that, what you've said, Chris. Definitely.
going back to the story where Bhagavati, he obviously has to raise his son alone as both mother and father, and by now he's got more than an inkling, and probably he knew about the prophecy as well that Lahiri Mahashaya had given about young Mukunda when he was a baby, that he'd be a spiritual engine. So he knew, and obviously the embers, the little sparks of of Yogananda's desire to for the spiritual path were very apt. He was just recently tried to run away to the Himalayas. So he had to, but he obviously had a responsibility as a father as well as a disciple of the Lahiri Mahashaya, because he needed to raise him, obviously. But there are, in India, there's something they're called Bala Yogis, where they're literally, they express their yogi nature in childhood, and they leave home in their childhood as yogis, and they're called Bala Yogis, and there's many of those. You'll see them in India, and so he's trying to tackle these two things. He's trying to let Yogananda flourish spiritually by exposing him to Swami Pranabananda, but also at the same time give him some responsibilities. So don't just run I don't want you to be a Bala Yogi. Basically, you've got some spiritual engineering work to do as a spiritual engine to the masses. So he has to raise him in a way that he stays within the confines of a society. So I think he just manufactured this task. So he said to, yes, okay, he wants to go to Varanasi. He's obviously going to go see Lahiri Mahashaya's, temple or home. Swami Pranabananda is just there. Let me, show him someone who is genuine, rather than him having to seek out, random yogis and swamis, of which there's thousands, if not tens of thousands, in India. So he kind of directs him, but then gives him a task that's he's got definite task to do, not just roam to the Himalayas. So it kind of does the two things of facilitating his spiritual ardor, and then also guideposting it in a way that's structured and allows him to grow. Because as a 12-year-old, now you have a job. When you're young and your parent gives you a job, you're so especially a job like this, giving a letter to someone, it's such an exciting job that you'd really want to make sure you do correctly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. Wouldn't you? Imagine your father's just given you a letter of business purposes to give to a friend, and then you're going to manage to complete that through meeting a Swami. That's no normal ask, is it, of a usual childhood. So yeah, it's interesting. So the father's got a letter for him to hand for business purposes, and he's also got a letter of introduction that he gives to Mukunda to say, will say who you are. But what really jumped out at me in this section is he said, you will benefit by his company, talking about Swami Pranabananda. And there's a definite lesson here too. The importance of being around those who exude divine qualities and who are good company is often talked about in many different aspects, but particularly in this path that we're on. Priyank.
Yeah, much. I've really taken this to heart, this teaching. I've, since becoming a Griyavan, actually, I've changed my friendship circle. 90% of my friendship circle is pretty much gone. And that was because of this. And my wife thought I was being really cruel in doing that, because very long friendships I've kind of let dwindle away. But I've really taken this teaching to heart, and I must say it's done wonders, because I just remember, she says, oh, it's not nice to have such long such a close relation that you've had to just, go away, to step away from it. But then I reminded her, I remember this conversation, I said, okay, so think about the last 3 meetings that we had, and we usually met at, at a restaurant or out in the city, and think about the conversation we had, and, the energy of the place, and what that was compared to what we're trying to achieve in our lives and in our spiritual path. And it's completely at odds. We're not here to socialize. That might be a benefit. You might have some fun socializing, but isn't it infinitely better to socialize in a spiritual company, such as what we have on this podcast, or such as Lauren, what we have after a young adults meeting when we go to a cafe down the road? It is infinitely better. What's the conversation? How's the energy? It's just, everything. Then if you set up your life in this way where everything is supporting you spiritually, then it becomes easier, becomes more seamless. There's much less inertia. There's much that's much more willingness from you, as well as the company that you're hanging around with. Chris?
I'm nodding my head like a Churchill dog.
Which no one else will know, Chris. No one else. None of our audience will know what you're talking about. You must explain.
Oh, the Churchill dog. Gosh, can I even explain? I think people think you're calling Churchill a dog right now. Churchill a dog, yeah, which people might agree with, to be fair.
That is not what this podcast. We're not calling people dogs. Go on, Chris. Explain.
This is a positive idea.
Yes.
Exactly. There's bulldog. There's a bulldog caricature that was made famous. This is a segue upon segues, isn't it? Made famous by, was it an insurance company, and TV adverts, reigned supreme with this little Churchill nodding dog, like the nodding characters that you can buy for your car, and with the big bubbly heads and things like this, and the head just nods in agreement to everything that they were saying was good about this insurance company thing.
So it's becoming it's become a thing, isn't it, in the UK? Everyone knows about the Churchill dog.
British UK thing, yeah. No one else would know. Thank you, Frank, for calling it out.
Good. So, good. Mike's not here. Mike would be like, "What are you guys talking about?" Even though he was here for a few years.
Yeah. So I was nodding away in agreement, and it sounded, what you were saying. I could have said myself. I could have by verbatim said what you said, Prank, because I experienced the same thing, with conversations with my wife, with my friends, and I have to add something to it. And the reality is actually, for me, it was quite painful, a painful emotional experience where my ego was trying to hold on, but the better sense, my better judgment was telling me, was guiding me, toward the truth, toward what we were saying, which was the distance that you have physically does not mean one through love. It doesn't mean you love them less. You love them even potentially even more. And it's funny, when I was going through this period of, say, separation from my old group of friends, and I've talked about this in the podcast before, where my life kind of collapsed, and my job, I left my job at the girlfriend at the time. We separated, and all my friend groups just vanished. And it was a blessing, really, in disguise. At the time, it didn't feel like that. But I was then reading one of the lessons, and in the lessons, I think it may have been lesson number 30 or something in the old lessons, something like that. Guruji then said, and it just so happened to be at the time I was struggling, just so happened to be the next lesson I read. It was saying, hey, you've got to love people. If you love them, you have to let them go, in a sense. Don't cling on to people in that sense. If they're parting ways, if your paths are diverging, keep steady on your path. So yeah, I was nodding my head in complete agreement with what you were saying, Greg. It is a harder line, but it's the line worth taking.
I'll shake my head in contradiction to a little bit of what you just said. So I think you said you were doing yourself a disservice. You were saying the ego is holding on, and you don't want to eradicate these these relationships. I would say I don't think it was your ego. It was probably your, the empathy you have, because you knew that disconnecting yourselves from these group of friends would actually be quite painful for them. So your love and understanding. Me, on the other hand, being a little bit more heartless and a bit more detached, I had no such empathy. But I think you made such a good point, because so I didn't find it that difficult. But you made such a good point, because it's not that you love them less or that you don't love them. It is, you do continue that relationship. They'll be in your prayers afterwards, just as they were before. And I still do think about those beautiful friendships that I have. It doesn't mean that, they're a central part of my life.
Transformed.
Yeah, and don't forget, like, we have karmic bonds with these people, and sometimes those bonds are incredibly strong, even though we know they're not necessarily currently providing a higher spiritual fulfillment, and sometimes you do just have to learn to step away from that and put yourself in environments that really do help you in your journey. And I think it's very important, especially in the beginning. It's one that I've been particularly learning these past few months, year or so. The lesson has well and truly sunk in now.
Intriguing.
Yes, but that's for another time. But on this subject of being in good company, Chris found some really, really lovely pieces of writing. And I think it would be really useful for everybody listening, and for us as well, to read them and to let them sink in. So, Chris, take it away.
Sure. So this is the essence of self-realization, a little transcript from that. So do delve into that book if you want to hear more about this kind of thing. And it goes, the company you keep is important. If you leave your coat in a room where people are smoking, pretty soon it will smell smoke. If you leave it outside in the garden later on, when you bring it indoors, it will carry with it a fragrance of fresh air and flowers. Such is the case with the mind. Your garment of thoughts absorbs the vibrations of those with whom you mix. If you mingle with pessimists, in time you will become a pessimist. And if you mingle with cheerful, happy people, you yourself will develop a cheerful, happy nature. That's by Yogananda.
So that's, I think, as a bit of a lesson for us on this podcast, because the listeners are mingling with us, and in some way we with them. So let us never be pessimistic on this podcast.
True.
We don't want to put that energy out there for the rest of eternity to in the internet ether. The essence of self-realization, is that a book, Chris?
Yeah, it was something titled "The Essence of Self-Realization." I found online, and I need to dig into it a little bit more, but it may have been just the title of a transcript of a speech that I gave.
Okay, right.
Titled that way, but this is
right. So he says, and then he carries on saying, environment is stronger than willpower. To mix with worldly people without absorbing at least some of their worldliness requires great spiritual strength. Beginners on the spiritual path, especially, should be very careful in the company they keep. They should mix with other devotees and try not to mingle with ego-saturated worldly people. They should especially avoid people who are negative, even if those people are devotees. Whether one becomes a saint or a sinner is to a great extent determined by the company he keeps.
So this is actually the essence of self-realization, which is a book, The Wisdom of Paramahansa Yogananda by Kriyananda. That's what this one is.
Very powerful as well, isn't it? and very true. We can all take something from it as well. Yeah. So following that, let's do a little summary in case our readers and listeners have got lost along the way. So Mukunda's asked to go on a sightseeing trip to Banaras, and his father has taken the consideration, said yes, handed him a letter for business purposes to be handed to his friend Kedarnath Babu, which his address he cannot find. So he's going to have to go to Swami Pranabananda. And he then hands a second letter to Mukunda and says, this will be your introduction as to who you are. And then he says, mind, no more flights from home, with twinkling eyes. So that's where we're at in the point so far. I think Priyank might have a little something to add here.
Yes, you know, Guruji, even as a boy, and this story is an example here, he had a strong desire to travel. What do you guys think of that for us? Do you think we should fan our desire to go see places, see the world, travel, be a divine roaming gypsy? I've always been unsure. I've always thought that you know, the path is so much about being like living a simple life and not needing to have all these material things and needing to go out after all these outward experiences. So I always thought traveling maybe falls into that category where it's taking you like kind of away from what you're doing on this path. But then sometimes when you do travel, you have these magical experiences that you wouldn't have had if you had not traveled. So I'm in two minds about it. And being the personality that I am, I prefer the austere path usually, which is the one that doesn't require any traveling for any purpose whatsoever. But I don't follow that, unfortunately. Chris?
I think the answer to this, to my mind, is it depends. A bit of advice that I had previously, which I thought was really great, which is follow your highest excitement. And if something excites you, there's maybe in the essence of that is a calling to something, a calling to adventure, a calling to, come across a path of a loved one, which for me, is how I met my wife. And now, you're talking to me, an Irish guy that lived in London and now lives in Brazil, on an eco-village. So very much travel has been a core part of my life in recent years. So I think yes, in general, I think it's very healthy for people to travel and broaden the minds and see different peoples of different cultures and be able to understand and love more broadly than maybe some siloed love where you only love the nation of which you were born in or something like that, because when I traveled, the thing that I saw is people are the same, no matter where you go. So it kind of dissolves this idea of nations and borders and ideas of us and them and things like this. So I think it's pretty healthy overall. But in general, I accept your point, Priyank. I think maybe you should focus more on the higher priorities in life, and that's a very engineering kind of approach. But Guruji, for one, he led by example. He was enthralled and excited and followed this passion and desire that he had to explore and see have new experiences, essentially. So he knew from a young age as well he was going to do these things. He had visions and things like this, so he was probably following those visions. But I think it depends. If it's something that speaks to your heart, then go for it. You never know what's around the corner.
Very, very well said. But Chris, if I'm traveling and I miss out on practices because I'm on a plane or I can't do my practices as well because I'm traveling, or I'm in a hotel or taxis or whatever. Doesn't that then hinder? Should you be going on holidays that only? I just spent a few weeks in India, as you guys know, and my wife and I we were on this chaotic road trip that 6,000 kilometers from north to the south of India, and back again, and we were every day we were on the road driving for 4 or 5 hours. And we were getting we were getting behind, and we were doing our practices in the morning, and my wife said, "Oh, should we shorten our? Should we leave early?" She didn't say shorten our practices. She said, "Should we leave earlier?" And I said, "If we leave earlier, then I know that I'm going to squish my practices. I'm going to try and get up earlier, but effectively, what's going to happen is I'm going to spend less time doing my practices." And I said, basically, there's no excuse, especially if you're on a holiday where you can pick the agenda. There's no excuse for you to miss your practice. So we didn't, and every day we were falling behind, but we stood firm on not missing our practices. But going back to Chris, something you said about your, as a Northern Irishman, going now spending or settling in Brazil. This is something that I'll go back to that previous point I said about the Western mindset being more amenable to these principles of these grand principles of being detached and being able to just go where the wind takes you, where God is directing you, because an Indian mindset does not allow such things. It's very restricted. This is your job, this is where you live, this is who you marry, this is your relationship with your parents, and it's very, very fixed. Whereas so for me, doing what you're doing, just leaving my one life and just starting a new thing is just doesn't sit well with me, because I'm so restricted in the way my mental makeup is. But you guys can do it so nonchalantly, so with so much ease and so much freedom. It's quite a beautiful thing, actually. It's something that Indians very much admire about the Western mindset.
I don't know if Irish people fall into this Western mindset that you're espousing, because it's something that everybody's more shocked that I'm doing than anything, to be honest. So, I don't know. I feel like I would say divine gypsy myself, but I feel like more just a gypsy, I think, at times, because often I've fallen into the trap of my meditations and practices, falling to the wayside. I lived on a boat as well. I was literally a gypsy at one point, living on a boat in a canal in London, and that was tough. Like, that was a lifestyle decision, because I was building that boat with no electricity and running water for months whilst I was working, doing all sorts of things. So definitely, the more you take on in life, that in responsibilities and things, the more it can encroach on spiritual dedication. I found that very tough, I have to say. I thought you were more speaking to me and poking me, Priyank,
Not this time.
In your approach. For many months, it was a very big distraction for me. So, and admittedly, it did put me off for some time, set me behind in my practices, and only now, after some significant amount of months, am I back into a better routine where my life is stabilized. So it's taken some time to get that back after crazy amount of traveling and change in my life. So yeah, I mean, it's a very real, I would say, threat, to your spiritual life and practice, because you go astray slightly. In several years' time, you could be quite far off where you really want to be. So it is a real question mark. But that's where this kind of community, that what we're doing, is actually so essential for me to have kept me anchored. When I was traveling, I didn't have the center in London center to go to, and that was an anchorage in my life. But now we have this community, I suppose, us coming together, and that's an anchor for me, spiritual anchor. So good company in the virtual sense is extremely important as well in this modern era of traveling.
Mike's traveling right now. He's in Florida, which is why he can't be on this podcast. But yeah, he would he has a very as much as Guruji, a very strong affinity for traveling. So I'm glad he's not here for this conversation, because he would have beat my question down. He'd be like, no, you must travel. Lauren.
If I may, I'm just going to delve into the specificities of the language of your question, Priyank, about the desire for travel. Because I've had a little look through just this little section that we're reading, and never does he write that he desires to travel. He writes that he has a love for travel. He says that he delights in seeing these scenes and new faces, but there's no desire. And really, I feel that we are walking the desireless path. That's the goal, really, to not have any desires that pull you back for any lives, that's it, cut them off. So I feel that, if you have a love for travel, fair enough. But I'm with you both, that as long as it doesn't take away from the purpose of your divine goal, then fine, delight in those new scenes. But I think once we start desiring, that's the tricky point.
Would traveling potentially have a strong spiritual accelerate degree in it as well? Because we've potentially, I would assume that we have had many incarnations, we've lived through many nations, or we've inhabited many different countries and cultures in the world. So maybe when you're traveling, potentially, for all we know, we could be going to places we've been, kind of moving through some past karma and kind of working through that. I found when I was traveling with my wife, there are moments when things might get heated out of nowhere seemingly, and I thought, oh, that's kind of strange. I wonder if there's something a little bit deeper to being in a certain place with somebody and trying to be the best that you can be. And I think it all maybe kind of comes full circle, but I think it really very much depends on the individual. But certainly with Guruji, he's lived many lives, and he made his travels spiritual. He's not going to take selfies on a beach in Thailand somewhere in
Chris,
yeah.
You talked about your previous births. I thought you were a rebirth virgin. I thought you were brand new.
How do you say it, Frank? When you're not incarnated, you're
resurrected. But I don't think we fall into that category.
Neither.
But there is something to that, Chris. I have to say, like in my own experience, I've lived in different lands for short periods of time. And, there are particular places on this earth that whenever I return to, I feel a stronger connection with myself. And that really has sparked some very changing, life-altering insights for me. And had I not had that experience, then I don't know if I'd be where I am now. So it all kind of feeds in, doesn't it, to one? And I think the intellectual mind perhaps will never truly know. But
Lauren, are you talking about Essex, Kent, and Surrey and places like that?
No, I lived in Spain for a very, very short time.
Nothing wrong with those places.
No. But it's funny. It's funny how lands affect you. Like when I lived in Spain for like a very short time, it was only like a couple of weeks. That was incredible. That changed my whole life. But then I lived in Greece for a longer time, and for me, energetically, that wasn't aligning at all, and I could feel that actually that was pulling me further away from where I was meant to be. So everything's energy, isn't it, really, in a sense? And we just have to attune ourselves to the one that's most serving for our life. But anyway, we digress quite a lot, don't we? We will get back onto the story. We always say that we're never going to segue, and here we are again. So his father said yes, and he sets forth with the zest of his 12 years, as he says. And as he reached Banaras, he said he proceeded immediately to the Swami's residence, and the front door was open. No surprise from what Priyank has told us about life over there. And he made his way to a long hall-like room on the second floor. I found this very intriguing, that not only did he go in so boldly, but maybe that's a cultural thing that I didn't understand, but also that he knew to go to the second floor. I don't know about you, but if I went somewhere new, I'd probably just stand in the hallway and kind of look around a little bit aimlessly, thinking, is someone going to come out anytime soon? So yeah, I found that interesting, and I wasn't sure if there was something to that, perhaps. And Chris, what do you think?
I actually don't know if this is anything really related to do with what you're asking, but when I first read this, The Matrix is I'm very fond of the Matrix movies. And reading this and kind of picturing what was going on, in this scene reminded me of a scene out of the Matrix in some way. There's like a very long stretch of a corridor, and there's this enlightened kind of mystical, being there, unlocking something within you, on giving Guruji this, spiritual experience ultimately that we're about to go into in a sense. It was very Matrix-like-esque for me, this kind of silly, but in those movies, they're guided, aren't they? They're kind of guided by this sense of like purpose, or this sense of knowing what to do and being in the right place at the right time. So just to link it back to what you're asking, yeah, maybe it was obvious. Maybe there was like a kind of a sign like upstairs or something that he doesn't tell us about. But maybe it was obvious to go up to the second floor. There's nothing on the first floor of use to him. So, but no, maybe he was more guided as to where to go. That's my fanciful take.
Yeah, this whole rudeness, the Western notion of it being rude to impose yourself on someone or going to someone's home without their permission is very much less there in India, very much less prominent, especially, as I say, in rural India, because as I say, there's open door policy, and he kept his door open. His door was open, and you're within your rights to go in, and if you don't knock, you'd go call. You'd go in and call, and if there's no one downstairs, you check upstairs.
He was probably used to having many guests as well, right? This is somebody who I'm sure many people would have gone to for counsel and gone to, for taking in wisdom and learnings, lessons. So maybe it was somewhat of a well-trodden path, and Swami might always keep his door open for visitors, and Yogananda was kind of following the flow that had already been in place potentially.
Yeah, for sure. And then he goes on to describe who he saw. I'd actually like to read this out verbatim, because I think it's quite a lovely description. It gives us a lot of what we need to know. So it says, a rather stout man wearing only a loincloth was seated in lotus posture on a slightly raised platform. His head and unwrinkled face were clean shaven. A beatific smile played about his lips. To dispel my thought that I had intruded, he greeted me as an old friend. Baba Anand, which means bliss to my dear one. And Priyank is holding up a picture of said saint for those who can see it. For those who can't, the description again gives that image.
And the picture is in the book, of course.
Yes, yeah. I loved the description. I thought it was really, really touching. But not only that, I loved the greeting. I loved the first word uttered, and I wondered if it was a greeting that he would say, or if it was actually a blessing that he was bestowing. I'm not sure, to be honest. Listeners, you can give us your 2 pence on this. But yeah, it's quite special.
The way the
Um,
brackets are in after, say it says Baba Anand,
Yeah.
which means Baba means, you know, a saint, and Anand is bliss. So his, and then in brackets it says bliss to my dear one, which would imply that he's saying he's offering Anand or bliss to this saintly figure who is Mukunda, which is a very strange greeting, actually. Not one that I've encountered in India, actually, in that way. Because it's so perhaps there then in that he's actually recognizing Mukunda's status, actually, because it's not a normal, in India, that's not a normal greeting, as it were, especially to a boy.
Yeah, although he did have quite a clairvoyance, didn't he? Quite a spiritual insight, so it wouldn't be surprising, as we're about to find out. So Mukunda, touches his feet, kneels down, touches his feet, and he asks, "Are you Swami Pranabananda?" And he nodded. Yeah, Priyank.
Before we get to that, I thought we'd just talk a little bit about the raised platform that he was sitting on.
Yes.
So that would kind of imply that he probably held satsangs. Satsangs is it's basically a fellowship with a saint, as you might call it, a satsang. And so he probably had people, as Liri Mahashai did, around his home to seek out his blessings, and he probably gave discourses. And we know, I think, that he wrote, he had a commentary on a scripture, I believe, on the Gita or something. So he was learned in that way, so he probably did hold satsang. So that is why you'd have a raised platform in that way. So people sitting can kind of see you. Yeah, Lauren?
But going off of that, interestingly, it's only slightly raised. It's not as if it's like a big stage that we would, go to in the theatre. It's just ever so slightly up. I wonder, actually, just, coming off of my thoughts now, if that has something to do with, the disconnect from the energy that runs through the ground. If you've then got another platform that is absorbing that as well, that could actually potentially be of use to you when meditating. That's just speculation, I'm not sure, but
no,
it feels correct.
Very good speculation. That's the truth. Guruji talks about insulating, when meditating, insulating yourself from the floor and other things like that, to kind of cocoon your energies as you meditate.
Yes.
And the other thing I wanted to just talk about is that his head and unwrinkled face were clean shaven. So that means he shaved his hair off, which is in stark contradiction to how Guruji had long hair. Now, saints, they say that when you're on the spiritual path, you should, monks do anyway. They're requested to shave off their hair, and Lauren, this goes for females as well. So you'll see Indian saints with no hair as well. So one reason is to prevent vanity type things, but the energy reason is that when you shave off your hair, and obviously that sprouts new growth, the focus and the attention will naturally go in that direction. So like, even without thinking or practicing it, your energies are naturally directed upwards, and especially on the crown of the head. But that doesn't apply to self-realized master, obviously, like Yogananda. And there's some science about why certain saints such as Yogananda, realized masters, keep their hair and their beard, and that's to do with their kind of divine status and anchoring themselves so as to stay, as opposed to, they're in that cosmic consciousness pretty much all the time, so they have to anchor themselves.
Yeah, I thought also there was something that once one had shaved their head, it was also a denotion of, that's the start of your spiritual journey, like your true commitment to that path of becoming one. So when the hair grows, perhaps the longer it is, it denotes your spiritual advancement. I've heard somewhere. I'm not sure if that is true, but I can imagine if you have been practicing an extremely long time and you have shaved your head, and you are becoming more absorbed in your true self day by day, that as one's hair grows, that all feeds in. Who knows? Again, speculation. But yes, it is. It's an interesting one, isn't it? So yeah, he asks, "Are you Swami Pranabananda?" And he nods, which I think is interesting that he asks. And to which he replies, "Are you Bhagavati's son?" His words were out before I had time to get father's letter from my pocket. And apparently he was in astonishment at this moment. I mean, imagine that. Priyank was saying that perhaps, I don't know if you did actually say that. I thought you said at one point that he looked very much like his mother, so perhaps that was the reason why he thought. I'm wondering if it's his clairvoyance, but maybe it's a mixing of the two. And then the Swami goes on to say, "Of course, I will locate Kedar Nath Babu for you." And it says, the saint again surprised me by his clairvoyance. He glanced at the letter and made a few affectionate references to my parent. Imagine being in that moment. Very, very special. I wonder if Mukunda even bothered to give him the letters. I'm not sure he would after that. Yeah, it's a very, very powerful moment between the two. I'd be curious to hear any insights from the listeners as to how you felt when you read it. Chris, what do you think?
Yeah, the context of this, of course, is that Yogananda is traveling and he's a young boy. So he's walking around, taking in all the sights. Everything's new, and he's probably very excited, happy to be traveling. And there's a lot of information to take in when you're traveling, and it can be quite overwhelming at times. Frank talked about traveling. I don't think traveling necessarily is for everybody if you're not of that mindset to be open to taking in this, essentially this information, this tidal wave of information with new sights. And then he comes in and he's greeted by the saint who is going to shock him, in a couple of different ways that we won't cover in this episode, but this is the beginning of that experience for him. So he's taken in this information, and this is just him assimilating everything, right? He's trying to assimilate all this information. So in a sense, maybe the yogi was preparing him for what was to come, because he could have easily waited and opened the letter and kind of played a little bit like, oh yeah, I know, yes, I see what you want, and let me, he could have played it differently, right? But he didn't. He was quite direct, and I think this was just this moment of preparing him for taking the plunge in the pool of reality of what it means to be a yogi, and a true yogi, a saint. So maybe this was in some way intuitive, intuitively getting Yogananda, a young Mukunda, ready for the experiences to come in quick succession as well.
And on that, I feel like that's a really good note to leave this episode on, because we are about to delve into what happens next. It's extremely, I mean, there are no words. It's really ineffable. But it's very, very intriguing, and there is lots to come in the rest of the chapter that we can deep dive into. I believe Priyank has a few words to say.
Yeah, just quickly, the Kedarnath is obviously a person here, but that name is a very cool name. Kedarnath is probably the most important temple in India. It's a Shiva temple. So Kedarnath means it's a kind of affiliated with Shiva. It's like the lord of the plain, or the land, or the fields is Kedarnath, and that's what his name means. So another shout out to the naming of all these people in the Autobiography of Yogi, and also in India, because there's strong roots with mantra, as we talked about in the past episode, and with having someone's name that's close to the words that are close to divinity, and naturally it's like an affirmation that we, every time you say the name, it's both an affirmation for you and for the person that's receiving it, to go towards the origins of what that name is. So it's a very cool name. Mukunda is name, that's the one of the names of Krishna is Mukunda. So you refer to Krishna as that, as child Krishna. So that's Guruji's birth name. And yeah, that's a nice, it's a nice way to think about all those names that are in the Autobiography of Yogi, that they've got some cool meanings which you can scratch beneath the surface. So you may not have thought of that when you saw the name, but there's a very deep meaning for that name. Yeah.
I have to say, I really, really love how much really valuable information you give to this podcast, Priyank. Every time I feel like I'm in school, but in the best way. And it honestly, I absolutely love it. I love learning, and I feel that it's really valuable to have, because there's so much beyond just what we read. And yeah, thank you so much for sharing.
I don't talk too much about all this stuff.
Not at all. If anything more, please. Maybe we should have a school with Priyank where you can.
It's much more enlightened people. But together, I did a vlog on Kedarnath temple, which we'll post on there for you, because I went there. I went there on a pilgrimage a few years ago.
And on that note, Chris was wondering about giving everyone homework. We're back on the school trend. I would say, for our listeners, I don't know if you two agree, but I would say the homework would be to read the rest of the chapter instead of a specific chunk, purely because a lot is about to take place, and it might be worth digesting it before we delve deeper. If you're not able to read it, please don't worry. We're going over it in great depth and detail as we go on. So yeah, thank you all so much for joining us for this episode. Do let us know your thoughts, and we really, really look forward to sharing space with you again.
Jai Guru.
Jai Guru.